Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers? We have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. In today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Bryan W. Van Norden. Bryan is a James Monroe Taylor Chair of Philosophy at Vassar College in the United States of America and chair professor in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University in China. Bryan is the author, editor, or translator of 10 books on Chinese and comparative philosophy. He has also published multiple op-eds in the New York Times and written a TED-Ed video on Confucius that has been viewed over 1 million times. In today's episode, Bryan and I talk about the 6 titans of Chinese philosophy, and we discuss why Chinese philosophers should be incorporated into what is deemed the canon of philosophical thought. We draw comparisons and contrasts between Chinese philosophical thought and some similar ideas that exist within Western philosophy. We also talk about why the Western canon needs to be diversified if it is to survive, and close with a conversation about the current political situation in China and its relation with the rest of the world. I bring you my conversation with Bryan Van Norden. Bryan Van Norden, thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, I brought you on here today because you are a professor of Chinese philosophy, and it's not something that I know a great deal about. But just to get started, can you tell us some of the tenets of Chinese philosophy, and in particular how it might differ from European and American philosophers and philosophy that presumably most of our primarily North American listeners would be more familiar with?
Yeah, well, the Chinese philosophical tradition is every bit as rich and complicated as the philosophical tradition that goes back to Greece and Rome in the Anglo-European world. So it's kind of hard to summarize. A lot of what I've done in my own work is to point out the ways in which Chinese philosophers deal with similar issues, but offer interestingly different answers to recognizable philosophical questions. So in a certain way, there's not a fundamental difference between Chinese philosophy and Anglo-European philosophy, which is part of what makes it a travesty that Chinese philosophy is not taught more in Western institutions, colleges, and universities. When we talk about Chinese philosophy, we usually start with Kongzi, who's better known in the West by the Jesuit Latinization of his name as Confucius. And Confucius lived around 500 BCE, and he lived in a time in which China was essentially involved in civil war. China was divided into states that were vying for supremacy. There was a reigning emperor, but the emperor, although he reigned, he did not rule. And so real power was in the hands of the rulers of the various states into which China was divided. And so they were all raising armies to fight for supremacy, and that involved heavily taxing the common people so that they could supply the weapons and reward successful generals. And then even within states, no one felt safe. If you were a powerful ruler, you might be assassinated. If you were a rich person, someone might want to steal your wealth from you. If you were a peasant, you were being taxed to the brink of starvation by your ruler, and other armies might invade your state and kill you and burn your crops. So everyone was suffering. So Confucius's proposed solution to this was to get virtuous people into positions of government authority and have people rule with virtue for the benefit of the common people instead of governing for their own individual benefit.
That
And
sounds like that last the context that you described reminded me a great deal of Machiavelli in that
mm,
Italy was not united, right, and there were lots of fiefdoms within what is
mhm.
currently a united Italy, but that last bit about ruling for the common good reminds me a great deal of Plato's Republic. How do we so it's interesting that already. I mean, just in a couple of minutes, I'm detecting some interesting parallels here.
Exactly, and that's what's so fascinating. So, as you may know, Plato lived in a time when Greece was torn by war, and also there was Plato said he was horrified by the level of corruption in Athenian government. And so he also thought the solution to his society's problems was to cultivate virtue in people and to get virtuous people into positions of government authority. Um, and also, as you point out, Machiavelli later critiqued the Platonic solution, saying that what was really important for a ruler was power, not virtue. I mean, Machiavelli thought that in an ideal society, you would have virtuous rulers, but in The Prince, he said we have to talk realistically about how rulers get and maintain power. And later in the Chinese tradition, you get a thinker, Han Feize, who similarly critiques the Confucians and says that virtue is unrealistic as a basis for government. But there are interesting differences between the way Han Feize discusses power and the way that Machiavelli discusses power, and also interesting differences between Plato's conception of how you cultivate virtue and Confucius's conception of how you cultivate virtue. And that's why it's valuable to study both traditions, because although they're dealing with recognizably similar issues, they're giving importantly different answers.
Yeah, it reminds me of I don't know who said it, but the best way to improve politics is to disqualify from office anyone who wishes to run for it.
Yeah, yeah, and you find that actually is one of the things that they say in the Tao Te Ching, one of the classics of Taoism. They say that only the person who doesn't want to rule is actually fit to rule. And you find something like a version of that in Confucianism. Confucians think the ideal ruler isn't seeking to get power. They take power because they think they need to in order to help other people, but they don't crave power for its own sake. And that also is similar to Plato's view about the philosopher kings and queens. They will take positions of authority when they have to, but they'd rather be doing other things if they could.
Yeah, I know that if you look at the globe, like historically, China was and still is one of the great civilizations. I read in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel that the only reason that we're speaking here in North America primarily English and also some French and Spanish
Mm.
and Portuguese. I mean, those are the primary languages throughout all of the Americas. But the reason that it's those four languages and not Cantonese and Mandarin is that the Chinese state, which at the time was centralized, recalled its treasure ships, but technologically, societally, at the time, uh, China was really the most advanced nation in the world, and so I'm only familiar with three Chinese philosophers, and you've already mentioned two of them. Confucius, of course, although I haven't read personally any of his work, and also Lao Tzu, who you mentioned, and I have read that the Tao Te Ching and Sun Tzu on the
Uh-huh.
art of war.
Mhm.
Whether that's, I guess there's some. I'm not sure whether that counts as philosophy or whether it's more, management and strategy. But I was wondering. So those are the three that I'm familiar with, and I make no claims to any sort of expertise. But uh, beyond those names, like who else are the titans of Chinese philosophy?
Well, that's a great question. I'll answer it if I can. Let me go back to the excellent point you made a moment ago. It's a standard observation among historians of science and technology to note that China was more technologically advanced than Europe at right up until the beginning of the modern scientific revolution. So if you had to pick a society to live in around the Middle Ages, say around the 10th century of the Common Era, you'd be much smarter to pick China in the Tang Dynasty than Europe at the pit of the sometimes called the Dark Ages in Europe, because China was so much more technologically advanced. And one of the things that transformed the modern world was the rise of course, modern natural science and also the development of modern firearms. But of course, the irony is that gunpowder and firearms were invented in China in the Tang Dynasty, and then the knowledge of them spread to Europe. But because of the differences in the kind of warfare that were being, and the kind of enemies people opposed in Europe and China, firearms turned out to be a much more useful weapon against knights and against castles than they were against the large hordes of Mongol invaders that people faced in China. So firearm technology really caught on in Europe just because of an accident of history, that people happened to be fighting opponents who were very vulnerable to firearms. So Europeans really invested in developing firearm technology. So within a few centuries, when China next interacted with the West in the Opium Wars of the 19th century, the West had perfected firearm technology and so had a real technological advantage. And so it wasn't that China wasn't as good at technology. In fact, they were better. It's just an accident of history that the kinds of opponents people were fighting in Europe encouraged the development of firearms technology, and that paid off accidentally in the long run. Whereas the kinds of armies that people were fighting in China, firearms were kind of useful, but they weren't nearly as important, so they didn't become central to technology in China. But that changed the course of history. So that's a really fun tidbit. But to go back to your question, who are some of the other great names? In the ancient period in China, it's sometimes called the period of the 100 schools, because there were so many different philosophical movements. There was, of course, Confucianism and Taoism. There was also what's called Moism. There was legalism. There was the Five Phases school, the school of names. Those are often called the Big Six
Okay.
movements in the ancient period. And
Can
people
you?
don't know
I
about most.
haven't heard. So, I mean, I've heard of Taoism and Confucianism. The other four I'm hearing about for the first time.
Yeah,
Uh, so, uh, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but like, can you tell us what's unique about each of these schools? And it sounds a little bit like, ancient Athens, where there were schools of philosophy popping up everywhere. And I hope I'm not uh, drawing too many parallels, but I'm fascinated to see just how similar, at least at a high level, these two very different cultures are treating philosophy. So I'm sorry, but my question is, these four schools that are new to me, of the big six, can you give like a 1 or 2 line summary of what made each of those schools unique?
sure. And you're exactly right. There are many interesting parallels. I always say when you're doing comparative philosophy, there are two common mistakes people make. The first common mistake people make is they overemphasize the differences between the two traditions. And so they end up saying, oh, these are completely different. They have nothing in common at all. Well, they must have something in common because they're both philosophical traditions. But then the other extreme people go to is they'll overemphasize the similarities and they'll say, oh, they're exactly the same. But if they were exactly the same, it wouldn't be interesting to study the Chinese tradition as well. So I think it's helpful to do what we're doing, which is say there's a lot of interesting parallels, but also things that are distinct. Now, you were asking about the list of the major schools. This is a traditional Chinese list of the major ancient schools, and they mention Confucianism and Taoism. If I wanted to just summarize what Confucianism is about, it's about trying to lead a good life. And then as a political philosophy, The idea is that if you get people into positions of government authority who have cultivated virtues to live a good life, they will rule better than people who are self-interested, or people who just want power, or people who think that the use of force can solve all your problems. The Taoist school is multifaceted, but one way of understanding it is the Taoists are kind of suspicious of the effort to try to become virtuous. So think of all the people you know who claim to be virtuous, and think of how often they turn out to be hypocrites or phonies or self righteous instead of actually righteous. That's what the Taoists notice. And they say, well, the effort to try to make yourself virtuous is self defeating. It's kind of like the effort to try to look really beautiful isn't as beautiful as natural beauty. Or if you try to write in a really elegant way, sometimes that makes your writing less elegant because you're trying too hard to sound elegant. So that's what the Taoists focus on, the way that artificial effort often gets in the way of things, including the cultivation of virtue.
Again, that reminds me of Stoicism, where the emphasis is simply on being a good person and not on making social displays of your virtue.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, exactly. And the Taoists are concerned that this is what Confucianism ends up being. That's part of their critique of Confucianism. And then the Moist school was founded by this guy, Mozi. And Mozi is an interesting character, but he's very multifaceted. But the simplest way to understand it is Mozi says, look, you Confucians, Taoists, you're making things too complex. What you want to do is produce the best consequences and just do whatever maximizes wealth for people in general, social order. You eliminate as much as you can murder and thievery and treachery, and you maximize population as much as you can, which might surprise us as a goal for China. But historically speaking, for a lot of Chinese history, the problem has been underpopulation rather than overpopulation. So Mozi is like, just simplify this. Do the things that will produce the most wealth, populousness, and social order. So it's a kind of what we call a consequentialist in the West. And then you've got the school of names, and one way of understanding them is they focus on the fact that language is often tricky and unreliable. And they explore the ways in which words often don't track the way the world really is, or they don't track morality. And so the school of names often explores paradoxes as a way of showing us how language is treacherous and we can't trust it. Then you've got sometimes called the five phases, or the yin yang school, which attempts to describe the structure of the universe in terms of yin and yang, these complementary paired opposites, but also five phases that things go through in a certain kind of order. They try to use this to predict the course of history and predict people's fortunes. And to this day, if you go to a fortune teller in China, they will use five phases theory to predict what's going to happen in your life. So we've got the five phases school, the school of names, the Moists, the Confucians, the Taoists. If you know a little bit about China, you might be surprised, well, why aren't Buddhists on the list? Buddhism came to China from India in probably the first century of the Common Era. And then it became very influential, but it's not an indigenous Chinese philosophical system, but it is really interesting and important. And China made important contributions to Buddhism as a philosophical and religious movement.
Okay, so you left out legalism.
Oh, yes.
So that was the sixth one of the.
Yeah, you think I would know this by now? I've only been doing this for 30 years, so right. And so legalism says, look, government isn't about cultivating virtue; it's about setting up institutions that give people clear guidance about what to do. with clear rules that people know how to follow, and harsh punishments for violating the rules, and lavish rewards for following them. So the legalists say you can't rely on people. They say there are going to be some people who are virtuous and will do the right thing for the right reason. But the legalists say most people are self interested. And so you've got to appeal to that self interest in your system of government.
And that sounds like the Leviathan having the state as the ultimate arbiter. And so, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it is a lot like Hobbes' Leviathan. And it's interesting, of course, Hobbes' Leviathan is famous for giving one of the seminal formulations of a state of nature argument for government authority. In Hobbes's work, Leviathan, he says, well, look, before there was government, people lived in he doesn't use the phrase state of nature, but people lived in a state of war of all against all. So that's why government authority is justified, because no matter how bad the government is, it's better than the state of war of all against all. Interestingly, the Moists give a version of that argument. The followers of Mozi give a version of that argument in ancient China. But the Moists say it's not self-interest that leads to conflict in the state of nature. It's the fact that people don't agree on standards of right and wrong. So if, for example, you have a standard where if you produce something, it belongs only to you and only you can use it, whereas I have a standard where, well, we should all share the things that we produce. So if you've produced a really good tool, I should be able to take that and use it, but then you can also share my tools. But you might say, no, that's not this right standard. The right standard is it's my tool. You have to pay me if you want to rent my tool. And I'm like, well, I'll let you use my tools. Why is that fair? And so we end up fighting. And Moses says this is what's going to lead to conflict in the state of nature. Or to use a racier example, maybe you and your partner believe in free love and I believe in strict monogamy. And so, you're like, oh, well, we should, sleep with each other's spouses and that's cool. And I'm like, no, that's not cool at all. And somebody ends up getting murdered because we have very different standards about these things. And so Moses says that's why you need government. You need someone to unify your standards of right and wrong. So it's not about self-interest, it's about agreeing about standards for adjudicating disagreements.
So is there a Chinese equivalent of pluralism or cosmopolitanism? Because that's what pluralism and cosmopolitanism are really all about. At heart is how to get people with different standards of right and wrong, of what is appropriate or inappropriate, and still being able to live peacefully and hopefully in a prosperous manner, cheek and jowl, living together, despite not having a monolithic society determining what is and isn't allowed, or what is or isn't right and wrong.
A lot of people find that in Taoism, especially the version of Taoism that we get from Zhuangzi. And you mentioned having read Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and virtue, which is attributed to Lao Tzu, who is traditionally said to be an older contemporary of Confucius. And there's many, many translations. Some people would say that the classic of the way and virtue attributed to Lao Tzu is one of the three most commonly translated works in world history, along with the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. So a lot of people are familiar with that. But in China, the Zhuangzi, which is named after its supposed author, Zhuangzi, is often considered an even greater philosophical and literary work. And some people read the Zhuangzi as emphasizing that there are different ways of living that are appropriate for different creatures. And he often uses animals as examples. He says, fish like to live in water, birds live in trees, deer live on the land. Which is the right way to live? Well, it depends on what kind of creature you are. And that's a metaphor for the idea that people live differently. There's a great story in the Zhuangzi I'm just doing this from memory, but as I recall, there's these supernatural creatures like the Emperor of the North Wind and the Emperor of the South Wind, and they visit their friend Chaos, who has no apertures in his face. And they say, "Oh, it's so sad that Chaos has no apertures in his face. Let's help him." And so they drill apertures in his face to give him, nose and mouth and ear holes like we have. And they said, and they kept drilling and drilling until he died. And the message is, don't try to force other people to be like you are, because the way they are might be appropriate for them. So some people have seen in Zhuangzi a kind of cosmopolitan ideal in the Chinese tradition.
Yeah, just from your brief summary of those six schools of Chinese thought, or of Chinese philosophy, or the big ones, I found myself nodding and agreeing and saying, "Yeah, I could get into that." And then you described the next ones. I could agree to that. Uh, and I want to come back to something that you mentioned very briefly a few minutes ago, towards the start of our conversation, in that you lamented that not enough people
Mm.
study Chinese philosophy when it's just as rich and diverse, and presumably we have as much to learn from it as we do from the European
Mm.
tradition. And I mean, I, I agree, but just in principle, I agree. I always want to learn, but there's a problem
Mm.
in that there are only so many hours in the day,
Mhm.
and I don't devote all of my time to philosophy. And perhaps as a philosophy professor, you would question my wisdom in that, but I have other interests,
Sure.
and I have other responsibilities. I have a job, I have a family. I like to read fiction, I like to read nonfiction. With nonfiction, philosophy is simply one of many areas of interest of mine. And then once I get into philosophy, of course, it can subdivide. So given the vast number of topics, and even within philosophy, the wide array of potential areas of study, uh, why Chinese philosophy? What's your argument
Mhm.
to make it make it rise up the priority list, to make it worthy of study? And I'm saying this as a comparative measure,
Sure.
because of course, I'm not saying that it's not worthy of study, but like everything, not almost everything is. And so help me understand. I'm already starting from a point of being interested, but it's on a very long list of things that I am interested in. So why should I put Chinese philosophy higher on that list of things to delve into? And don't address this to me as an individual, but to anyone that
Mhm.
has multiple interests. Why should people study Chinese philosophy more when there's a limited curriculum, a limited number of lecture hours, of reading hours, and we only have 80 years to
Yeah.
learn.
Yeah, no, that's a perfectly legitimate question. Here are some of the reasons why it's important for people to learn more about Chinese philosophy. One of the most basic is China is an increasingly important world power, and if the United States wants to, uh, you know, keep being an important power in the world, we have to understand other powers that we interact with. And Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism have had a huge influence on Chinese civilization. And the current paramount leader of China, Xi Jinping, has really been promoting Confucianism along with other aspects of traditional Chinese culture. So it behooves us to understand this philosophy better. I remember I was pleasantly surprised to learn that one of the at least a certain point in history, one of the best collections on Chinese communist literature was at the Hoover Institution, which is a conservative think tank at Stanford University. Why does a conservative think tank have a great collection of communist literature? Because their attitude was, well, look, if we're going to compete with communism, we have to understand it. We shouldn't be ignorant of it. So whether you agree with or disagree with Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, these are immensely influential movements in the world today, and they're influential in China, which is a competitor superpower with the United States. So we need to learn about them.
Yeah.
That's one major
So,
reason.
so they've already adopted the key tenet of the philosophy of Sun Tzu, which is in order to win a battle, you must first understand your enemy.
Exactly, exactly. And I think people in China, although they get things wrong, of course, they understand the Chinese government understands the US government better than the US government often understands the Chinese government. So that's one major reason. Another reason is that the United States is, we pride ourselves on being a diverse nation. And from what I know, Canada does too, but we're increasingly diverse as time goes on. And so the United States is going to be a nation in which being a white person of European descent is fast becoming a minority. And so educational institutions have to change to reflect the diversity of student bodies. We can't go on having philosophy be just a temple to the achievement of white males. We have to recognize that we have a diverse student body, and some of those students may want to learn about the East Asian traditions or the South Asian traditions or the African traditions or the indigenous American traditions. So just to survive in a diverse culture, philosophy has to diversify or die. That's a second reason. And a third reason is just Chinese philosophy is just really interesting. And so people often forget that in the 13th century in Europe, the works of Aristotle were rediscovered after having been largely lost in the Middle Ages. And it was actually very controversial when people like Thomas Aquinas wanted to bring Aristotle back into the university curriculum. People said, you're watering down the curriculum. This isn't part of our tradition. But people like Aquinas succeeded in making Aristotle again a part of the Anglo-European canon, and that enriched the tradition. So the canon of philosophical works has never been fixed. It's always contested. Things come into the canon, they fall out of the canon. There was a time when Cicero was absolutely central to philosophy. You didn't know Western philosophy if you didn't know Cicero. I think Cicero's interesting, but I didn't think we lost a lot by having him be, drop out of the canon. And there was a time when Hume was not a central figure in the canon, but he was rediscovered in the English-speaking philosophical tradition, and he became a part of the canon. So now, yeah, we'll have to make room in the curriculum for Chinese philosophers, but the transformation of the canon is something that's always been going on. It's never been fixed. And if people think, oh, this is the one canon we've always had, that's never been true if you look at the history of philosophy.
So I find that last point to be quite compelling. Let's evaluate and go with the best. But I want to push back a little bit. I found your second point. I agree with your premise. The student body, particularly in universities, but demographically across at least Canada and the United States, is becoming much more diverse. So no argument there. But I'm not sure that should be a motivating factor
Mm-hmm.
in incorporating indigenous Chinese Indian philosophy. Like I would think, like, let's have that disputation of what should be canon based on the relative merits, based on the
Mm-hmm.
insights, based on historical and sociological significance. Uh, and I would hope, and perhaps this is a naive hope, but I would hope that that disputation and that evolution of what is deemed canon or what or the core concepts would happen regardless of the demographics of the student body or of the society at large. So I'm curious, do you think that am I being naive? Is that a fair point, or is my critique a valid one?
I see where you're coming from, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that the evolution of the current canon was not a fair or even-handed process that was politically neutral. And I think this, if I may make a more general point, I think it's often the case there's this mistaken assumption that, well, in the past, when white males dominated the curriculum and dominated positions in business and university, that was a system where we were fairly picking people just based on their merits, and it's just a coincidence that all the white males happen to
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And
Which
so
is
we
which
know
is
that.
why again I support your
Yeah,
third
yeah,
point
yeah.
that, like, let's look at the canon, let's look at the world of philosophy, and let's reevaluate and have that disputation. So I fully, but I'm coming at it, I guess, as a motivation of scholastic integrity. There has been a tremendous amount of bias that went into. Like, I'm willing to grant that point unreservedly. Let's try and do a reevaluation and take
Mhm,
the greatest ideas from wherever they happen to
mhm,
come. And I would suspect that some of what's in the canon today would remain, and a lot of it would be dropped to be replaced with the best of things from around the world. And I would imagine it'd be much strengthened. But I would hope that that's done out of a motivation uh, of desiring excellence, and not reflecting the demographics of this student body or of the
right.
society that you happen to be living in.
Well, there's 2 points that are worth making here. One is, look, if we're not getting, for example, and we're not getting as many female students or students of color in philosophy classes, and we're not retaining them, something's going wrong somewhere.
Right.
And so we have to do something to address that, just as a matter of survival of the discipline, if the discipline's going to survive. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind the reason why Chinese philosophy isn't standard in the curriculum. Because when Jesuit missionaries first encountered Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, they immediately recognized it as philosophical and valuable. And in the early Enlightenment in the West, people often said that Confucius was the patron saint of the secular European Enlightenment, with people like Voltaire and Leibniz and people who are lesser known now but very influential in the early Enlightenment, like Francois Quesnay and Christian Wolff, praising uh, Chinese thought. So why didn't Chinese thought then remain central to the philosophical curriculum? Peter K.J. Park has written a great book about this on Africa, Asia, and racism in the formation of the philosophical canon in the West. And he points out that it was only with the rise of Western imperialism and pseudo-scientific racism that Chinese philosophy got excluded from the canon. And people like Kant and the followers of Kant said, only white people are capable of doing philosophy. There is no philosophy outside the tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. So both South Asian philosophy and Chinese philosophy, East Asian philosophy, including Chinese philosophy, African philosophy, indigenous American philosophy, all got excluded. Now, of course, the vast majority of my colleagues in contemporary philosophy would reject the explicit racism that underlies this approach. But I've been struck by how often people feel very comfortable when I say, why don't we teach Chinese philosophy in the curriculum? They'll say, well, but there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. And I'll then ask them, okay, well, of the thinkers who are considered Chinese philosophers, whom have you read? And can you tell me why you did not regard them as philosophical? And they very casually say, oh, I've never read any Chinese philosophy, but it doesn't exist, right?
Well, because clearly I'm a philosophy professor. If it existed, I would have read it. I haven't read it, therefore it doesn't
Therefore, it
exist.
doesn't exist. Yeah. But that casualness with which they dismiss that, I mean, this is why, I mean, some of my colleagues, give me some pushback and say, why do you have to talk about this in terms of racism, Bryan? Like, why do you have to bring that up? Isn't it just ignorance? But it's more than ignorance it's ignorance that people don't know there's Chinese philosophy. But something else is going on when they feel very comfortable saying, without any argumentation, oh, I know there's no philosophy in Africa or Asia. How do you know that? and they can't articulate why, but they feel very comfortable in rejecting it. So this makes me feel like there's something more going on here than just ignorance. And that's why I think students are picking up on something when they come into a philosophy classroom and they're like, oh, that's interesting. All the guys that we're teaching in this course are guys, and they're guys who look like the professors. And when they don't feel welcome because of that, that's not their mistake. They're picking up on something. They know something weird's going on here, and they're right. People who look like them were excluded systematically from the curriculum for racist reasons. And they won't know the details of that, but I think they're legitimately picking up on something. So that's why I think it's not fundamentally wrong to say we can answer that need to have a curriculum that more accurately reflects the student body. Because I think students aren't just being narrow-minded, they're picking up on something that's a genuine structural factor that's led to a result where the curriculum looks really white, where all the philosophers look like me.
Well, I mean, I guess this was news to me, by the way, but I'm
Yeah.
just picking
Yeah,
up on
nobody
what you
knows.
said, that Confucius was deemed a titan, again, to use your phrase, of the philosophical world, and then was deliberately excluded, not on the basis of his philosophy or the merits of his work, but on the fact that, well, no, we need to keep it. I mean,
Mhm.
that strikes me as pretty
Yeah.
much a definition of racism, which
Mhm.
uh, then is probably unconsciously perpetuated. But then, if you haven't read Confucius, you don't know if he ought to be part of
Right.
the canon, and then you're very well educated in what you're told is the canon, and that just becomes definitionally the canon. And there perhaps needs to be a reevaluation of what ought to be um, deemed the core works of global philosophy, but drawing on the wider traditions. And I think that probably there would be some components of what's currently canon that would remain, but a few things would be dropped, and a lot of other more diverse writings would be
Mhm.
incorporated. I think that would be is that your next project then? Is defining the new canon and getting it widely accepted?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I on my website, bryanvannorden.com, BRYANVANNORDEN.com. I just
I'll,
spell
I'll
it.
link. I'll link to that. I'll link to that in the show
People
notes so that
always get
people
my
can
name
click on
wrong, so
that. Yeah.
that's why I do it. But I've got a bibliography of what I call readings on the less commonly taught philosophies, especially East Asian philosophy, like Chinese philosophy, South Asian philosophy, primarily Indian philosophy, African philosophy, and indigenous American philosophy. And I taught for 3 years at Yale NUS College in Singapore, which was a very ambitious and largely successful experiment in developing a multicultural curriculum. And freshmen, so first year students at Yale NUS were given a required 2 semester philosophy sequence in which they read great philosophers from largely from the East Asian, South Asian, and Anglo European traditions. And so they read Plato side by the great Confucian philosopher Mengzi. They read Aristotle side by side with the great Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. They read, Descartes next to the Bhagavad Gita. And so you could combine all these interesting philosophical traditions. And so I think a new canon would be much more diverse. And we'll have to see which philosophers in the Anglo European tradition survive this competition. And I'm not an opponent of the. I love Plato. I love Aristotle. I regularly teach Bertrand Russell and Quine and Davidson. But it'll be interesting to see which of these philosophers, when people have alternatives to read in other traditions, are still worth reading a few centuries later. Again, another example, Boethius, his Consolation of Philosophy, and also some of his other works were central to the European curriculum for hundreds of years, as was Cicero. And again, I've read Boethius. He's kind of interesting. I read Cicero, kind of interesting. I don't think you've missed anything if they're not part of the curriculum. And we may find other figures who are now central parts of the curriculum don't survive this winnowing either. We'll have
I,
to see.
I want to take that course.
I know it's a
That
great
sounds
course. It was a
fascinating.
great course. It was a great course.
All right, I want to ask you about something you alluded to it earlier, but we didn't get into it, and that is the connection between philosophy and politics.
Mm,
And we are at a point right now where tensions between the United States and China, politically speaking, are very high.
hmm
It's the type of rhetoric that I'm hearing, at least on the U.S. side, is reminiscent of what used to be said about the what was then the Soviet Union and
hmm
what was called the Cold War. And I understand one of the motivations you supplied for studying Chinese philosophy is essentially to understand your enemy or to your
hmm
opponent,
hmm
uh, and I wonder if there's if one happens not to be a fan of the Chinese Communist Party,
hmm
which has ruled China for decades,
hmm
and if studying Chinese philosophy can be deemed in some way a or not studying it, but like endorsing Chinese philosophy as innovative, as worthwhile of study, not in an instrumental way to understand your enemy, but simply because you want to understand philosophy, you need to include in your list of studies the Chinese philosophers, whether that can be considered in some way an endorsement of what I consider to be a dictatorial authoritarian state.
hmm
So I guess I'm asking you for an argument of separating historical Chinese philosophy from contemporary Chinese politics.
Yeah, the Confucian tradition is, I think, similar in a certain respect to every other major tradition in religion and philosophy, in that it has been co opted by people as an excuse for authoritarianism or for oppression of others. And I always warn my students, if you're looking for a philosophical or religious system that is exploitation proof, that nobody can use can manipulate in a way to exploit others, I can't help you, because humans are really good at figuring out ways to take good ideas and to put them in the service of bad causes. So Confucianism certainly has been used to justify the status quo at various points in Chinese history, even if the status quo was exploitive, and to justify authoritarianism. But at its heart, what Confucianism is about is cultivating virtues in individuals. And if the phrase virtue sounds old fashioned, just good character traits, whatever you think good character traits are. And part of cultivating good character traits in individuals is giving them the courage to stand up to authoritarian and abusive leaders and to speak out against them. So, at its heart, Confucianism is about creating the kinds of people who will speak back to power in the name of what will help the common people. And Xi Jinping has been promoting Confucianism. Part of the reason for that is that Xi Jinping would prefer that people follow the paternalistic government philosophy of Confucianism instead of classic liberal philosophy. This is lowercase l liberal, like the tradition that goes back to people like Locke, for example, and Rousseau. Um, because the Confucian tradition is more paternalistic and can provide a justification for obeying the government. But I always say there's a danger in telling students to read the classics, because if you tell them to read the classics, they might actually do it. And if they pay attention to the Confucian tradition, they're going to realize that leaders like when Confucius got government positions, he used it to criticize those in positions of authority. When his later disciple Mengzi got into positions of government authority, he criticized what rulers were doing. Confucians are very annoying to have in positions of authority because they're always critiquing abuses of government authority. So you could certainly be pro-Confucian and anti-authoritarianism, because the Confucian political view isn't about the arbitrary use of government power, and it's not about using government power to enrich or empower the elites. It's about reforming government so it benefits the common people.
Okay, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to learn basically more about everything. If someone is listening who, like me, has only a passing familiarity with Chinese philosophy, or perhaps none at all, but based on our conversation over the last 3/4 of an hour is interested in learning more, what's a good next step? I mean, one option is I'm just going to not let you leave, and I can talk to you for the next 6 hours, and that'll be great for me. I'm not sure that a 6-hour podcast episode is going to be of interest to folks, but if we do want to learn more, uh, can you recommend a YouTube series, or a book, or a set of books that will take us to the next level? I'm not quite sure I'm ready to read the foundational texts of the 6 schools, or the 4 that I'm not already familiar with. But is there a good introduction that gives me more detail than we can cover in a 1-hour conversation?
Sure. So, for example, I actually have a YouTube channel, and I have a series of video lectures covering Chinese philosophy from Confucius to Xi Jinping, focusing primarily on Confucianism, Taoism, Chinese Buddhism. And so I could recommend that. I've written a book, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, which is, I'm told, a quick read. And it talks about both the way in which Chinese philosophy was excluded from the canon and why we should bring it back. But it also gives concrete examples of ways in which you can bring Chinese and Anglo-European philosophers into dialogue. And I also talk a little bit about what philosophy is and why philosophy is important, the kind of influence philosophy's had on the development of civilization in positive ways. So that's a book that people might find interesting. And if you want to just jump into learning more about ancient Chinese philosophy, I wrote a book, Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, that assumes no background and takes you through those major early thinkers, including Confucius, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Mengzi, Han Feizi, Mozi, all those people we've talked about today.
That sounds great. I will link to your YouTube channel and to these books in the show notes. So if anyone is interested in that, you can click on the links and get more information and read and watch. So I want to thank you, Bryan, for your time. This has been great. Any last thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I just hope people will take the time to learn a little bit more about Chinese philosophy. And I think it can really contribute, I hope, in the long run to China and the United States getting along better. I think there's a tendency to often demonize the other, the people who seem different from you. And I'd like to see more understanding and less demonizing going on between the United States and China, especially in a world where both China and the United States are so powerful.
And between us all.
Yes.
All right. Bryan Van Norden, thank you for taking the time to speak with me on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zelinsky. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.